Hey folks, I'm here with another fantasy map drawing tutorial, and today we're going to go over farmlands, and that includes fields, farmhouses, barns, and windmills. All sorts of designs that you could use for your next fantasy map. All right, let's plow through this. Today I'm going to be using a circle template, a ruler, a pencil, and eraser. Today I'll mostly be using a fine tip micron pen. I like to start things off with a thin straight line and pencil, just to keep myself orientated and symmetrical. And I'm gonna lay some guidelines out for another 2 crop fields. Using a ruler to make sure everything's kind of straight and symmetrical. And I'm making sort of a slanted, angled, rectangle square shape. So I'm just laying out a bunch of lines that'll be kind of my tilled crop field. And before I go through in pen, I'm gonna draw any sort of overlapping pieces. So in this case, I'm just drawing some simple trees. Then next, I'm going to start on my barn. This one, a little more 3-dimensional and isometric, but I'll get into a simpler design afterwards. I also want to have the ground level have a smaller footprint than the top hayloft, with a bit of an overhang over the front main barn doors. I also add in a couple windows as well as some texture. And then over to the other side, I'm going to draw just a simple farming village. I'm thinking just very simple farming huts with either a domed or coned straw rooftop. I'm also drawing the doorways just a little off center to just add to the perspective of looking at it from a slight angle. Now I'm going to move on to the final structure in this design, a windmill. So I'm drawing out the guidelines of this windmill, but like the barn we did, I'm going to make the ground floor have a smaller footprint than the upper levels. And now I'm going to bring in my circle template. I'm going to align my vertical guidelines at the center of the door frame, and then I'm going to trace in a circle, which is going to be the outer perimeter of my windmill blades. And I then fan out a couple lines from that center point to the outer perimeter, and that's how I do my blades. And then to really finish this off, I'm going to add in a rustic farm fence. I use my ruler to draw a straight line for my top rail, then I go in and incrementally draw in a bunch of vertical posts. I also add in a few diagonal lines for braces, alternating the angle in which they connect. Now let's finish this up by following our pencil guidelines and inking this in, and keeping in mind anything that's in the foreground so we don't cross those lines. Now, when it comes to my tilled crop fields, I went for a bit of a thicker tip pen here. One thing that I'm doing for these simple crop field designs, I'm only drawing in one direction or the other. I'm not crossing over and squaring off these lines. It just keeps these really simple looking, and it is effective. So let's keep going and finish off this first example. Using my ruler where I need to, and we'll finish off this first example. For the blades of my windmill, we need to keep in mind what we're filling in and what we're not. So only filling in the parts of the blades that we need to and not continuing through with our guidelines. Once we get that all sorted, let's add in some texture now. Just sketching in a bunch of light vertical lines and then crossing a few of them over for where planks connect. And then finally, to really bring that straw roof together, we'll add in a bit more line work for straw texture. And there we go, we have our first design, some simple crop fields, and then some more intermediate farming structure designs. Now, on to the next, we're gonna go real simple here. You could use the same crop field design that we did in the previous layout, but I'm just gonna go through another simple way of drawing crop fields. So this time, no right angles. We're keeping those edges pretty angled. Then we throw in some of our foreground. After that, we're gonna do a more 2-dimensional looking barn. For that classic barn roof, we're gonna do 2 different pitches here. So the lower level of the roof is gonna be slightly less angled than the top portion of the roof, which is gonna be a little bit more pitched and steep in the angle. After we lay out our barn doors and our hayloft window, we're gonna go in with our texture. Just vertical lines for the wood planking, and for the roof, we're gonna texture it in with some shingles. So angled vertical lines following the pitch of the roof. And then we go in and add our tiny little horizontal lines that are going to give it the square shingle shapes. Okay, for our windmill, we're going to do the exact same thing we did in our first example, except this one's going to be more 2-dimensional and a little bit simpler. But overall, an identical design. So we'll start with our guidelines, which are going to be the windmill at its widest width all the way through. And then from there, we're going to mark out our ground floor, which like previous is going to have a smaller footprint than the upper levels. We'll offset the door, and then for an example, we'll add in a few windows, also offset. Let's mark out the center point of our windmill blades, bring back in our circle template, and create the outer perimeter. And I found this time through, it's easier to lay out our first blade and then do the next one directly opposite, kind of mirroring it. That helped me line things up a bit easier. Then let's switch over to pen, get our foreground pieces inked in, and continue on with the rest. Like before, we'll add in an extra step and get a bit of a farm fence going on here. But different than the previous fence, we're gonna add a corner here, bring it back down. That does make it tougher, but it looks really cool. And as long as you get your fence posts lined up in the same vertical orientation, it'll look great. Okay, here it is. A simple design where the structures are a little more two-dimensional. And we've got another example of crop fields. This time, a little more contained looking with that border around the tilling lines. Okay, now I'm gonna show you a few different crop field designs. So instead of the tilt look, these will be actively growing some sort of crop. So here's 3 different designs. In this first example, we'll start with some wheat. In the foreground border, I'm gonna draw longer vertical lines, but around the back 2 edges, I'm gonna draw smaller little vertical notches. And then I'm gonna fill it in with a bunch of minute line work. So that way, we don't need to fill in this entire area. We just need to add some specific texture to make it look like it's completely dense and filled in. Now, I don't even know what to call the crop that I'm working on here, but it looks really cool. I'm just drawing elongated vertical oval shapes. And for perspective, I start in that lowest corner and continue it on with the majority of that shape, but I'm not overlapping through any of these oval shapes. That gives it the perspective of all these crops being behind one another. For the back 2 edges, I'm just drawing this upside down U or sort of arch shape. I don't need to draw the full oval shape. And then again, just making it look dense by filling in this area with a bunch of arch-shaped tops of this crop. Now this one could look like a wheat field, a corn field, or some other crop growing on a stalk. Much like the first crop example, I'm just drawing vertical lines, and then I'm sort of just scratching out the shape at the top. It doesn't really look like anything in particular, but when it's all combined, it looks like a dense crop field. I just do those scratchy edges all around the back 2 corners, as well as fill in the denseness of this field. And all these examples look great. Next, I'll move on to a more advanced windmill design by starting with that guideline. That's gonna be the width of the thickest portion of my windmill. Then I fill it in from there. I'm sort of going for like a stone tower look, where it tapers in, but then quickly juts back out again for the top level. Add in our off-center door and window. And then I pull in that circle template once more. And using the guidelines on the circle template, I line them all up so everything is plumb. So one thing I'm doing to make this windmill look more advanced is I'm pulling over the circle template, and I'm gonna make these blades look a little different. So using a small circle template, I put my guidelines where the windmill blades are actually gonna start on the arms. Sort of like a fly swatter or spatula look. And with a little cross hatching here, those windmill blades look great. Now let's work on another barn shape. This one's gonna start very similar to our first example, except I'm gonna add a grain silo to it. So I create this cylindrical shape, as well as a cone for the top, and add in an off-centered door. Then for the front face of my barn, I draw a couple guidelines here so I know what's centered and what I can work off of here. And I use those guidelines to sort of build that barn look where there's some angled planks that support the wooden plank walls. And for the roof, I'm going for another shingled look. And to really sell the texture, I went across and did my horizontal lines and one through line. But then to do my vertical ones, I went in and did each vertical line individually. And that really makes them look like individual tiles. Now, let's ink this in. while I'm doing the shingles for this, now I'm actually going to ink them in individually. It just looks that much better. All right, let's look at all these designs we just finished here. Some more simple and two-dimensional, while others more advanced and isometric, as well as giving them a three-dimensional look. I want to thank each and every one of you for your subscriptions, your comments, your likes, and your support. It really means a lot to me. And let me know what you want to see next. I'd love to hear what sort of ideas you've got. All right, until next time.